An ordinary diver lowered his sonar and shapes of an ancient city appeared beneath the water. No one believed him until he pulled up a rusty sign that read "Saloon." What he found down there shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. Morning arrived over the Sierra foothills like the slow unfolding of a secret. The thin mist that hovered above the lake's surface clung to the air as if reluctant to leave, diffusing the first rays of sunlight into soft gold. The water was utterly still, a glass pane broken only by the distant sweep of an oar or the cry of a gull circling above. Along the far bank, the silhouettes of pine trees stood motionless, their reflections trembling in the faintest ripple of breeze. It was a place that looked as though time had forgotten it, a lake whose calm face hid stories no one cared to ask about anymore. Marcus Hill eased his small motorboat away from the dock, the hum of the engine barely disturbing the quiet. He had done this trip so many times that every movement came with the familiarity of ritual. Check the fuel, adjust the straps on his wetsuit, secure the oxygen tank, tap the gauge twice to make sure the needle didn't stick. He was not a professional diver, just a man who worked hard during the week and found peace beneath the water on weekends. In the town nearby, people knew him as the quiet black man who ferried tourists across the lake in summer and volunteered with the local cleanup group when the season ended. Few realized how deeply the water called to him or how often he descended into its still depths, collecting bottles, scrap metal, and bits of forgotten machinery from the muddy bottom. For Marcus, the lake was both workplace and sanctuary. He liked how sound changed underwater, how even the beating of his own heart seemed softer there. On the surface, the world moved too quickly. Boats buzzed, phones rang, people filled silence with words. But underwater, there was only breath, movement, and thought. The oxygen hissed rhythmically in his ears, the bubbles drifted upward like tiny silver ghosts, and he could forget the weight of life above him. That morning felt different, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the light, the way it shimmered through the mist, or maybe it was something deeper, an instinct that whispered that the lake was ready to show him something. He had set out with no grand plan, just another day of cleaning, another morning in the cool, forgiving silence below. But when he glanced at the old echo sounder fixed to the side of his boat, something unusual flickered on the grainy green screen. It wasn't the usual pattern of scattered dots that marked fallen logs or stones. These lines were too straight, too deliberate, long parallel shadows stretching across the sonar's display, forming a shape that seemed almost architectural. He frowned, adjusted the frequency, and ran the boat in a slow circle. The pattern appeared again, clearer this time. 2 horizontal lines, a rectangular outline, and what looked like the faint suggestion of corners. It reminded him of a foundation, or a wall. He muttered under his breath, thinking it must be a glitch. The sonar was older than some of the tourists he ferried in summer, and its calibration sometimes slipped after cold nights. Still, curiosity pricked at him. He marked the coordinates on his handheld GPS and killed the engine. The sudden quiet was absolute. He sat there for a while, the boat rocking gently, his breath visible in the chilly air. Below him, under more than 60 feet of water, something solid waited. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at a message sent from another time. He checked his gear again, out of habit more than necessity, and then slipped into the water. The shock of the cold hit him first, a sharp constriction of the chest, the sudden clarity of sensation that came with total immersion. The sunlight dimmed as he descended, fading from amber to dull green to the color of old glass. The deeper he went, the thicker the water seemed to become. Tiny specks of silt floated before his face mask, swirling lazily as his movements disturbed them. He followed the thin nylon guideline attached to the buoy above, careful not to stir up too much sediment. The bottom came into view slowly, like a photograph developing in the dark. First rocks, then mud, and finally, something man-made. He moved closer, angling his flashlight downward. The beam cut through the gloom and revealed a section of weathered wood half buried in silt. His pulse quickened. He brushed away the thin layer of mud, and shapes began to appear. Vertical planks, iron nails corroded to orange dust, a beam that once must have held up a wall. He raised the flashlight higher. Letters emerged faintly from the grain, carved deep but softened by time and water. S-A-L. He stopped, cleared away more silt with his glove, and read the rest. O-O-N. The word seemed impossible, a whisper from another century. Saloon. Marcus stared, frozen in the dim light. He had dived this lake for years and found everything from old fishing reels to lost anchors, but nothing like this. The structure extended farther than his light could reach. He swam along the beam, tracing the faint line of what might once have been a doorway. The wood was blackened, the edges softened, but the form was unmistakably human. He hovered there for a few minutes, recording everything with the small camera mounted to his wrist. He knew he couldn't stay long. His gauge already showed he'd reached the safe bottom time for this depth. Still, he hesitated to leave, as though afraid the moment would vanish once he turned away. When he finally surfaced, the world felt brighter and louder, almost wrong. The air stung his throat as he exhaled, clinging to the edge of the boat and letting his breathing steady. The mist had burned off, leaving the lake bare under the morning sun. He hauled himself aboard, stripped off his gloves, and stared at the GPS display. The coordinates blinked back at him, steady and silent. He jotted them down on a notepad, his hands still shaking slightly. He didn't tell anyone what he'd found. Not yet. The memory of the wooden sign and its ghostly letters felt too fragile to expose. People in town loved a good story, and by evening they'd turn it into a tale of treasure or hauntings. Marcus wanted to be sure of what he'd seen before sharing it. That night, at home, he plugged his camera into the old laptop he kept for dive footage. The video was dark and grainy, but there it was. The edge of a wooden wall, the faint outline of the letters, the ghost of the past illuminated by the narrow cone of his flashlight. He froze the frame, increased the contrast, and the word came into sharp focus. Saloon. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding again. What would a saloon be doing at the bottom of this lake? He knew the area's history in broad strokes, the gold rush towns, the mining camps that came and went, but he'd never heard of a settlement directly beneath these waters. He tried searching online, but nothing useful came up. The official records listed only the dam, completed 70 years earlier to control seasonal flooding from the mountains. There were vague mentions of displaced settlements, but no names, no maps. Sleep didn't come easily that night. He kept seeing the letters in his mind, glowing faintly through the murk. The next morning, before the sun was up, he was already back at the dock. The air smelled of pine and gasoline, and the sky was streaked with thin violet clouds. He told himself he'd just double-check the sonar, rule out a glitch, but deep down he knew better. The discovery had hooked something inside him, a mix of wonder and determination. He spent the day crisscrossing the lake, running sonar sweeps in long, patient lines. The screen showed more of those impossible shapes, straight corridors, square outlines, a faint ridge that looked suspiciously like a street. By noon, he had filled several pages of his notebook with coordinates. Each new mark on the map expanded the picture in his mind. A submerged town, intact beneath the water, sealed away like an artifact in a glass case. When he finally shut off the motor and let the boat drift, he felt an odd sense of reverence. The lake stretched around him, its surface smooth and indifferent, yet beneath it lay a history that no one remembered. He imagined miners and merchants walking the dusty main street, the clang of hammers, the jingle of spurs, the laughter spilling from that very saloon whose remains now slept in the dark. The thought gave him chills. That evening, back at the dock, one of the older fishermen called out to him. "Find anything interesting down there, Hill?" Marcus forced a smile and shook his head. "Just junk," he said, and loaded his gear into the truck. But as he drove away, the weight of what he'd seen pressed heavier on his mind. He wasn't sure what he would do next, only that he couldn't ignore it. At home, he spread the notes and sketches across his kitchen table. The lines formed a pattern, streets, perhaps, or the grid of foundations. The coordinates fell into neat alignment, too precise to be coincidence. He realized he was looking at something deliberate, planned, a town. And if a saloon survived under the water, what else might still be there? A post office, a church, a bank? The thought sent a current of excitement through him. He traced the map again, adding landmarks from what little he knew of the area's past. Each mark drew him deeper into the mystery. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock, yet Marcus felt surrounded by distant echoes, voices from another age, muffled by time and water. Before going to bed, he wrote a single line in his notebook. City under the lake, real? Then, beneath it, he added, Check County Archives. He didn't know it yet, but that small note would change everything. The next chapter of his life, and the lake's hidden story, was waiting in the dust of forgotten records and in the darkness beneath the water where an entire town still slept. The following morning, Marcus woke before dawn to the smell of rain. It wasn't falling yet, but the air carried that heavy scent of wet earth and pine needles that meant the sky was thinking about it. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the notebook he had filled the night before. The map he'd sketched, those lines that could only have been streets, stared back at him, daring him to prove it real. The single word, saloon, from his dive footage had become more than a curiosity. It was a challenge. Somewhere under 60 feet of cold water was a story no one had told in 100 years, and, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt responsible for finding it. He knew the next step had to be research. The lake wasn't new, it had been there since long before he was born. If an entire town truly lay beneath it, someone, somewhere, must have recorded it. But when he asked around the small town of Auburn Hills, most people shrugged or laughed. One old fisherman told him, "Sure, they flooded plenty of things when they built that dam. Barns, farms, maybe a few shacks, but a whole town? You've been watching too many treasure shows." Marcus smiled politely and said nothing. He had learned long ago that conviction was something best kept private until the proof was undeniable. At the county library, the air was thick with dust and quiet. Shelves of old records stood in tall rows, their drawers full of paper that smelled faintly of smoke and age. The woman at the front desk looked at him curiously when he asked about pre-dam settlements. "You mean before the reservoir?" "That's all way back in the archives," she said, leading him to a dim room lined with microfilm readers. She left him there with a stack of reels, and he spent the rest of the morning feeding them into the machine. watching headlines flicker past in ghostly black and white. Flood threatens valley, mining town evacuated, dam project approved. By noon, he had found it, a name that made his pulse quicken. El Dorado Valley Township, founded 1849. The article was brief, written in the clipped, factual tone of 19th-century journalism, but it confirmed what he needed to know. El Dorado had been a bustling mining town, one of many born during California's gold rush. There were saloons, a post office, 2 churches, a bank, and even a dance hall. But after a series of disastrous floods in the early 20th century, the government built a dam across the valley to protect Sacramento downstream. The water rose and the town disappeared. Marcus leaned back in his chair, reading the article twice. The name El Dorado seemed almost too perfect, as if destiny itself had buried it there for him to find. Yet no map in the modern library mentioned it. He tried searching the online county database, but every record ended abruptly around 1941, the year the dam was completed. Beyond that, there was nothing but blue, a lake with no memory of the people it had swallowed. He drove that afternoon to the small county records building. It was one of those squat, sun-faded offices that still smelled of typewriter ink. The clerk, a man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, listened to Marcus's request with mild interest. El Dorado Valley, you say? Haven't heard that one in a long time. My grandfather used to talk about it. Said his uncle mined there when he was young. Whole town got wiped off the map when they filled the basin. You're telling me you found something down there? Marcus hesitated before answering. Maybe. Wooden structures. Looks like part of a building. I just want to learn more before I jump to conclusions. The man nodded slowly and disappeared into a back room, returning a few minutes later with a rolled-up map and a box of yellowed folders. The map was dated 1938. When they spread it out on the counter, Marcus's breath caught. There it was, drawn in delicate ink. The winding river, the ridges, the valley labeled simply El Dorado. The streets were named after trees: oak, pine, maple. A line ran straight through the center of town, marked Main Street. Near the edge, written in fading pencil, was a small square labeled Bank, the bank. The clerk smiled at Marcus's reaction. You're welcome to make copies, he said. Just be careful with the original. Marcus nodded, carefully photographing each section with his phone. When he left the building, the rain had finally started, a slow, steady drizzle that blurred the distant mountains. He sat in his truck for a long time, listening to the patter on the windshield, staring at the map. It was real. The coordinates from his dive lined up almost perfectly with the center of the old town. Over the next week, Marcus became a regular at the library. He devoured every scrap of history he could find: old ledgers, handwritten letters, black and white photographs of dusty streets crowded with miners and horses. He learned about Samuel Brennan, a shrewd businessman who had made his fortune not from gold, but from selling supplies to those who hunted it. He read about the floods that had finally doomed the valley and the decision to build the dam, sealing El Dorado beneath the water forever. The more he read, the stronger his obsession grew. The town began to take shape in his imagination. The clang of hammers from the blacksmith's forge, the piano music spilling out of the saloon, the laughter of women on balconies draped with bunting during festival nights. It was as if the people of El Dorado were calling out to him from the depths, asking to be remembered. Yet, beneath the thrill, there was a quiet sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a diver anymore. He had become the custodian of something delicate. If he went public too soon, treasure hunters and thrill seekers would swarm the lake. He'd seen what that kind of attention did to other sites: artifact theft, broken relics, stories twisted for clicks. No, this had to be done carefully. He needed evidence strong enough to convince historians and scientists before word got out. He started upgrading his gear. His garage turned into a workshop littered with wires, batteries, and camera housings. He ordered a used underwater drone from a salvage yard in Nevada, its casing scratched, but the motors still strong. He replaced the seals, rewired the control unit, and attached an LED floodlight scavenged from an old scuba rig. To power it all, he built a portable battery box using car parts and solar panels. He spent his evenings soldering connections and testing the system in a rain barrel behind his house, grinning each time the propellers spun. By the time the rain cleared, he had a plan. He would map the underwater area methodically, building a digital picture of what lay beneath. Using the drone, he could stay above the surface, safe from decompression limits, while capturing footage no human eye had seen in generations. He marked out the search grid on his printed map, dividing the lake into sections like a chessboard. The area around the old Main Street would come first. On the morning of the new expedition, he loaded the drone, sonar unit, and enough coffee to last the day. The lake was calm again, the surface smooth as slate. He anchored at his chosen point and powered up the equipment. The sonar began to pulse, painting its digital portrait of the unseen world below. For the first hour, nothing unusual appeared, just ridges of silt and scattered debris. But then the screen showed a shape too precise to be natural. Two parallel lines, evenly spaced, running across the display like the edges of a road. He cross-referenced the coordinates with the map. It matched Main Street. He launched the drone. Its propellers whirred softly as it descended, the video feed flickering on his tablet. The image was murky at first, just drifting particles and the vague outlines of rocks. But then the light caught something square and flat, a wall, wooden, half collapsed but unmistakable. He adjusted the camera angle and saw another wall connected to it, forming a corner. He was looking at a building. The drone glided forward, and the structure grew clearer. Wooden beams, a window frame, a door hanging from one hinge. He swallowed hard. The saloon hadn't been a fluke. He continued along the grid, the footage recording steadily. More shapes emerged, stone foundations, the remains of a fence, what looked like the skeletal frame of a wagon. The deeper he went, the more the town seemed to reveal itself, piece by piece. Each discovery added to the growing mosaic in his mind. He was mapping the ghost of El Dorado. By afternoon, clouds had gathered again, and the light turned silver. He retrieved the drone and saved the footage. When he reviewed it later, he could trace the faint lines of streets, the grid of what had once been a living place. For the first time, he saw the scale of it, blocks upon blocks of human effort buried and forgotten. The realization left him quiet, almost reverent. That night, Marcus spread out his notes on the table once more. The copies of old maps, the newspaper clippings, the new sonar scans, all of it formed a single story now. The town wasn't a rumor. It was there, waiting. And if the saloon and the streets still stood, then surely something else had survived too. Maybe the bank mentioned on the map, the one marked only as Bunk, near the edge of town. He closed his notebook and stared out the window at the faint reflection of the moon on the lake. He didn't notice the hours passing. Somewhere out there, beneath that calm, silver surface, lay El Dorado, its story sealed in darkness, its gold long forgotten, but its spirit intact. Marcus felt an almost physical pull toward it, the same way a magnet finds true north. He knew he wouldn't rest until he saw more, and though he didn't yet understand the risks of what he was beginning, he sensed that the journey ahead would be far larger than anything he'd ever imagined. Morning broke over the lake with the pale stillness that comes after several days of rain. The air was washed clean, the pines stood dark and sharp against the sky, and the water reflected everything like polished glass. Marcus Hill stood at the dock, loading his gear into the small boat he had converted into a floating workshop. The smell of damp earth and gasoline mingled as he checked his checklist one final time. Oxygen tanks filled, sonar system calibrated, underwater drone charged, camera lenses cleaned and sealed. It wasn't just a dive anymore. It was a mission, and the excitement mixed uneasily with a sense of gravity he couldn't shake. He knew he was about to look further into the lake's heart than anyone in decades, and he couldn't tell if that thought thrilled him or made him afraid. The old fisherman from the previous week watched him from a nearby pier. "Back again, huh?" the man called. Marcus just smiled. "Still cleaning up the bottom," he said, though both knew that wasn't true. He didn't owe anyone explanations. The story he was chasing belonged to the silence of the water now. With a push of his foot, the boat drifted away from the dock. The motor sputtered, then hummed into a steady rhythm as he steered toward the middle of the lake. The lake was deep in that part of the valley, more than 100 feet in places, its bed uneven with the remnants of ridges and roads. He knew every contour of it from his sonar scans, each mark representing something man-made, walls, corners, and even what might have been the outline of a bridge. Today, he intended to map the largest section yet. He adjusted the heading to match the coordinates of Main Street from the 1938 map, then anchored the boat above the grid he had marked the night before. He set up his equipment carefully. The drone, freshly repaired, sat on a small rack at the stern, its LED lights bright even under daylight. The sonar unit emitted slow, rhythmic pings that pulsed through the water like a heartbeat. Marcus checked the readings, the patterns unfolding on the screen, familiar and strangely comforting. Each pulse painted a deeper picture of what was hidden below. The straight edges of foundations, the faint ridges of what once might have been boardwalks or fences. Every new pass revealed a little more of El Dorado's bones. After an hour of scanning, Marcus saw something different. The sonar displayed a dense, irregular shape lying slightly apart from the grid of streets at the edge of what the old map labeled as Market Row. It was long and narrow, with sharp angles, and the shadow it cast on the sonar image was unlike anything else. For a moment, he thought it might be a part of a collapsed roof or even a buried rail car. But the proportions were too regular, the density too uniform. He ran the scan again at a different angle. The outline was unmistakable now, metallic, smooth, and large. Something that didn't belong to the 19th century. He leaned closer to the screen. The image reminded him of wings. His pulse quickened as realization dawned. It looked like an aircraft, a plane, resting quietly at the bottom of the lake. But that didn't make sense. The town had been flooded decades before aircraft were common in the area. The dam went up in the 40s. Planes didn't start flying over this region until years later. He double-checked the coordinates, and a cold shiver ran down his spine when he realized that the point matched a note in one of the county accident reports he had read. A hydroplane had disappeared over the lake in 1986, its wreckage never recovered. The coincidence was uncanny. The wreck had fallen almost exactly above the original center of town. Marcus sat back, staring at the silent water around him. Beneath his boat lay 2 centuries of history layered like sediment. A town born from gold and fire, and above it, a modern ghost of twisted metal and vanished lives. The lake was a graveyard of ambitions from miners to pilots. He felt suddenly small, a witness to a history too vast to comprehend. He decided to investigate the aircraft later. For now, his goal remained the town. He wanted the clearest footage of the submerged streets yet, something he could use to convince professionals to help him preserve the site. He positioned the drone above the coordinates of Main Street and slowly lowered it into the water. The light from the LEDs shimmered against the surface before vanishing into the greenish dark. He put on the headset and watched the live feed flicker to life. At first, there was nothing but murk and drifting silt. Then, as the drone descended, shapes began to form. The image steadied, revealing a row of low stone foundations half buried in the mud. Marcus maneuvered the controls delicately, guiding the drone forward. The walls rose out of the darkness like monuments, their edges softened by years underwater. A few still bore traces of paint, peeling white and faded blue, clinging to splintered wood. He turned the drone left, following what must have been the main road. Along its edges lay fragments of metal and glass, perhaps lanterns, tools, or the remains of carriages. He increased the drone's altitude slightly, tilting the camera downward to capture the entire scene. The outlines of a street stretched ahead, framed by 2 parallel rows of buildings. He could almost see it alive again. Miners walking past, a wagon rolling over dusty ground, music echoing from open doors. The thought made his chest tighten. Beneath all the silt and decay, there was still something human in those ruins, a trace of laughter, work, and hope frozen in place. The sonar pulsed again, and a new shape appeared near the edge of his grid. It was a rectangle larger than the others, with distinct right angles and a thicker return signal, indicating solid construction. He matched its coordinates with the old map and smiled when he saw the note, Bank of El Dorado. That was his next target. If he could find the bank, he might find records or objects that survived inside. Unlike wood, metal, and stone, could endure the water's slow erasure. He guided the drone toward the site, but the current near the edge of the valley grew stronger. The feed flickered, and for a moment he thought he'd lost control, but then the camera stabilized. The structure loomed ahead, a rectangular shell of brick and rusted iron beams. The roof had collapsed inward long ago, and sediment filled most of the interior, but the doorway still stood like a gate into another century. Marcus maneuvered closer, careful not to stir up the silt. Inside, his lights illuminated fragments of desks, metal filing drawers, and something bulky lying half buried near the corner. He zoomed in. It was a safe, heavy, corroded, and sealed. The letters on its surface were nearly gone, but the faintest trace of engraving still caught the light. Bank of El Dorado, established 1849. The sight left him breathless. It was one thing to know history from books, and another to see it lying silent before your eyes, still guarding whatever secrets it once held. He wanted to touch it, to open it, but he knew he couldn't from here. The drone wasn't built to move something that heavy. He surfaced the drone and leaned back in his seat, the screen still showing the ghostly outline of the bank below. For a long time, he didn't move. He imagined the men who once stood behind that counter, counting gold coins while storms raged above, never knowing their entire world would one day vanish underwater. He thought of the names he had read on old documents, of the hopes that built that valley, and he felt a strange kinship with them. people chasing something just out of reach. By the time he returned to shore, the light was fading. The lake had turned dark blue, the first stars glimmering on its surface. Marcus packed his equipment and drove home in silence, the drone footage still looping in his mind. He didn't watch it right away. Instead, he sat on his porch, listening to the wind in the trees. The discovery of the bank changed everything. It wasn't just proof of the town's existence. It was tangible history, something no one could deny. That night, he reviewed the recordings frame by frame. The safe glowed faintly in the light, the engraving clear enough to read. Around it, the silt seemed undisturbed, as if the water itself respected what was buried there. The more he watched, the stronger his curiosity grew. What was inside? Gold? Documents? Or perhaps nothing but rusted emptiness? Still, he knew he couldn't leave it alone. He began sketching plans to retrieve it, a small salvage operation using lift bags and pulleys, the kind used for underwater recovery. It would be dangerous, especially alone, but if he managed to bring the safe to the surface, it would be the definitive proof of El Dorado's story. Over the next days, he prepared meticulously. He reinforced his equipment, checked the weather, and calculated the lift capacity he'd need. He even consulted a few diving manuals on the physics of buoyancy and sediment pressure. It wasn't just excitement driving him now, it was purpose. He felt as if fate had handed him a responsibility, one that extended beyond his own curiosity. On the morning he set out again, the lake was eerily calm, mist hung low, softening the edges of the world. He reached the coordinates of the bank and slipped into the cold, steady quiet of the depths. The descent was smoother this time, guided by the tether line he had placed during his last visit. The visibility was low, but he knew the way by memory. The slight dip where Main Street curved, the ridge that marked the edge of the old square, the faint shimmer of brick under his flashlight. When he reached the bank, he could see the safe waiting in its corner, motionless, unchanged. He attached the lifting straps carefully, his fingers numb from the cold. The work took time. Every motion had to be deliberate. When he finally inflated the lift bag, the safe shifted slightly, stirring a cloud of silt. For a moment, he thought it wouldn't move, but then it rose, slowly, like something reluctant to leave the past. The tether line tightened as he guided it upward, steadying its ascent. The strain on his arms was immense, his breath loud in his helmet, but he didn't stop. When he finally surfaced, the morning light blinded him. The safe bobbed beside him, dripping and heavy, a monument to endurance. By the time he hauled it into the boat, exhaustion had replaced exhilaration. He sat beside it, water streaming off his wetsuit, staring at the corroded metal box that had survived fire, flood, and time. The world felt suspended, as if even the wind had paused to watch. He didn't open it immediately. He wanted the moment to last, the proof of discovery, the knowledge that something long buried had finally come home. As he steered back toward shore, the weight of the safe seemed almost symbolic, a piece of history resting beside him, heavy with untold stories. The reflection of the sun shimmered on the surface of the lake, and for the first time, Marcus felt he understood what it meant to uncover the past, not to find treasure, but to give voice to silence. He knew that the days ahead would change everything. The town of El Dorado was no longer a rumor whispered in the dark. It was real, and it had chosen him to be its witness. When Marcus awoke the morning after raising the safe, the world outside his window seemed unnaturally bright. The sun filtered through the curtains in slanted gold beams, and the air carried that peculiar crispness that follows a night of wind. His muscles ached from the previous day's effort, but his mind pulsed with restless energy. In the garage, the safe sat like a sleeping beast, its rusted surface gleaming faintly under the light of a single bulb. He hadn't dared open it yet. Part of him wanted to savor the moment, to hold on to the mystery for just a little longer. He made coffee and stood for a long while staring at the heavy box. It looked ancient, its corners eaten away by decades underwater, yet it felt indestructible, defiant. The embossed words Bank of El Dorado were still visible beneath the corrosion. He imagined it sitting proudly in a small-town office a century and a half ago, the manager locking it at night while the miners down the street drank and laughed in the saloon. Every dent, every scrape carried the weight of lives long vanished. He fetched a chisel and a small hammer from the tool bench. As the first strike rang out, echoing through the quiet garage, it occurred to him that he was about to become the first person in more than 100 years to see what lay inside. The thought filled him with a strange reverence. He worked patiently, chipping away the outer layer of rust until the metal beneath began to yield. When the latch finally gave, the door creaked open with a slow groan, releasing a faint smell of mud and iron. Inside was not gold, not the glittering wealth of legend, but something far more human. A stack of ledgers, their pages fused together into a solid mass. A few metal coins, oxidized beyond recognition. A tin box sealed tight, and at the very bottom, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, a flat rectangular object that shimmered faintly when he lifted it into the light. He unwrapped it carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. It was a golden plaque, thin but solid, engraved with ornate lettering and a list of names. At the top it read, Founders of El Dorado, 1849. Marcus set it on the workbench and just stared. The names were beautifully etched, preserved almost perfectly despite the years underwater. He imagined the men and women behind them, the blacksmith, the preacher, the saloon keeper, the banker himself. For a long time he felt as though he could hear their voices again, murmuring faintly through the rush of his own heartbeat. It wasn't treasure in the traditional sense, but it was something infinitely more valuable. Proof that the town had existed, that these people had lived and dreamed and built something worth remembering. He cleaned the plaque gently and placed it in a padded crate. By the time he finished, the morning had slipped into afternoon. He called the local historical society and left a message, explaining that he had found what might be a significant artifact. He didn't mention the exact location yet. He wasn't ready to surrender that piece of knowledge to anyone else. For now, he needed to protect the site until professionals could assess it properly. That evening, he returned to the lake. The sky was streaked with copper and purple, the water calm as glass. The boat rocked gently under his weight as he sat at the stern, looking toward the coordinates where the bank still lay. He felt something close to awe, but also a rising sense of responsibility. The discovery was no longer just his secret. It was a part of history that belonged to everyone. He thought of how fragile such things could be, how quickly greed or carelessness could destroy centuries of preservation. The following day brought a sudden change. News of the safe had spread faster than he expected. He hadn't told anyone, but somehow word leaked. A reporter from a local paper showed up at the dock asking questions, and two men with metal detectors hovered around the shoreline pretending to fish. Marcus deflected politely, saying he had simply recovered a piece of debris. Yet he knew that the story would soon outgrow his control. People had always been drawn to the idea of lost gold, and even the faintest whisper of it could ignite imaginations. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, reviewing the drone footage again. The images of the bank appeared on the screen like a dream, slowly revealing itself. The collapsed walls, the skeletal remains of furniture, the safe's corner illuminated in the beam of his light. He zoomed in on one frame and noticed something he hadn't seen before. A faint glint behind the rubble on the far side of the room. It could have been anything, perhaps a reflection from the silt, but to Marcus it looked like more metal, perhaps part of the old wiring or even another container. The thought stirred a new curiosity. He knew he needed to go back, not just to document the bank, but to secure what he could before others tried to intrude. The next morning, he checked his equipment again. The oxygen tanks were full, the drone batteries charged, the sonar recalibrated. He moved through the preparations automatically, the motions as familiar as breathing. But beneath the calm surface of his focus lay tension. He could feel the invisible weight of the lake pressing against him even before he entered it. When he arrived at the site, the weather had turned. A wind swept down from the mountains, rippling the water and scattering the first fallen leaves of the season across the surface. The light had that pale quality that makes everything look sharper, colder. Marcus anchored the boat at the same coordinates, lowered the drone into the water, and descended after it. The first touch of the cold enveloped him instantly, seeping through the wetsuit, clinging to his skin like a second layer. As he descended, the colors drained from the world. The surface light vanished above him, replaced by a thick green haze. He followed the tether line slowly, the faint hum of the drone just ahead. When he reached the bottom, his flashlight beam revealed the familiar landscape of ruins, beams, foundations, remnants of human effort scattered across centuries of silt. The drone hovered near the bank's entrance, its lights glowing like twin eyes in the dark. He moved inside carefully, keeping close to the wall. The water was still, disturbed only by the slow pulse of his bubbles. The safe was gone now, leaving a rectangular impression in the mud. The space where it had rested seemed emptier than before, like a missing tooth in a smile. He directed the drone toward the area behind the rubble. The glint he had seen on the footage was still there, half buried in silt. With gentle movements, he brushed it clear. It wasn't another safe, but an old metal sign. The words were nearly gone, but he could just make them out. El Dorado Savings and Loan. He lifted it slowly, careful not to stir the sediment too much, and secured it to the retrieval line. As he did, a faint vibration ran through the ground beneath him. A shift, almost imperceptible, like the movement of something settling deeper. He froze. The dam engineers had warned in reports decades ago that submerged wooden structures could collapse over time as gases built up inside them. He backed away instinctively, but the vibration stopped as suddenly as it had begun. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. He spent another 10 minutes documenting the interior before ascending. When he broke the surface, the air felt almost painfully bright. He hauled the sign aboard, washed it gently, and studied it in the sunlight. The letters shimmered faintly beneath layers of oxidation, proof of the craftsmanship that had once been a source of pride. He realized then that the people who had built this town hadn't thought of it as temporary. They had believed it would last forever. Over the following days, Marcus's discovery drew attention from beyond the county. Historians and museum curators began reaching out, curious about the plaque and the footage he had shared with the local historical society. The small museum in Sacramento offered to preserve the artifacts, promising controlled conditions to prevent further deterioration. Marcus agreed, but on one condition: the location of the town would remain confidential until proper studies could be done. Even so, the lake began to attract visitors. Curious onlookers arrived at the docks, their questions relentless. Some carried cameras, others simply stared out over the water as though expecting the ghostly outlines of buildings to rise from below. Marcus found the attention both gratifying and unnerving. The secret that had once been his alone was now spreading, and with it came a responsibility he had not anticipated. To distract himself, he turned his focus to the technical side of his work. He installed a new sonar unit capable of higher resolution scans and began mapping the rest of the submerged grid in sections. The process was slow and painstaking. Each pass of the sonar revealed more of the town's structure: the symmetrical layout of streets, the remains of what might have been a small bridge, and even faint outlines that suggested gardens or fenced yards. He realized the builders of El Dorado had possessed a remarkable sense of order and ambition. Late one evening, after hours of recording, he replayed one of the sonar sweeps and noticed something that made him pause. A cluster of signals near the southern edge of the grid, far from the bank, showed a dense formation of metal beams arranged in a pattern that looked almost modern. The outline reminded him again of the aircraft he had seen earlier. He double-checked the coordinates and confirmed that it was the same spot. The plane from 1986. The thought of 2 centuries colliding in the same underwater grave fascinated him. Perhaps the pilot, unknowingly, had crashed directly into the ruins of the old town, sealing both stories together forever. He debated whether to investigate the plane immediately or focus on finishing the mapping. In the end, he chose patience. The town had waited this long, and the aircraft wasn't going anywhere. For now, he would continue documenting the structures systematically. The discipline gave him peace, even as the pressures outside grew. One morning, a university archaeologist arrived unannounced at his dock. A woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed and pragmatic, introduced herself as Dr. Evelyn Cho. She had heard about the discovery and wanted to collaborate. Marcus hesitated. He had grown used to working alone, but her credentials and quiet professionalism reassured him. Together, they reviewed the sonar data, and she confirmed what he had already suspected. El Dorado was one of the most well-preserved examples of a 19th-century mining settlement ever found in North America. Their partnership marked a turning point. With her help, he secured funding from the university for more advanced scanning and environmental testing. They installed temperature probes, water sensors, and even small cameras to monitor the rate of decay in wooden structures. Every measurement deepened their understanding of how the town had endured so long beneath the lake. Marcus felt a strange satisfaction watching science validate what his intuition had already told him. The lake wasn't just a place of loss. It was a vault of memory, preserving everything in perfect stillness. By late autumn, the nights grew colder and fog returned to the valley. Marcus often found himself alone on the water again, long after the others had left. The lights from the shore glimmered faintly in the distance, but the lake around him was pitch dark, its surface like polished obsidian. Sometimes he would cut the engine and just drift, listening to the faint lapping of waves against the hull, imagining the world beneath him. The bank, the saloon, the silent streets, all sleeping under a shroud of silt and time. It was during one of those quiet nights that he realized the true meaning of what he'd found. The gold, the buildings, the relics, they were just remnants. The real discovery was the endurance of human ambition. These people had carved a town from wilderness, faced floods and failure, and still built something beautiful enough to last beyond their own lives. The safe he'd raised, the plaque inside, it wasn't about wealth. It was about proof that people, even when forgotten, could leave behind something that refused to vanish. When Marcus finally returned home, he placed the golden plaque on a stand by his desk. Under the lamp's soft light, the engraved names gleamed faintly, each one a whisper from another world. He thought of the road ahead, the deeper dives, the aircraft waiting to be explored, the maps still incomplete. The story of El Dorado wasn't over yet. But, for now, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace, knowing that the past, though buried, was no longer lost. The lake had given up its first secret, and it was only a matter of time before it surrendered the rest. The frost had come early that year, painting the pines around the lake in thin silver, and each morning the air seemed colder, sharper, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Marcus could see his reflection in the still water when he arrived at dawn, his face lined with exhaustion but alive with purpose. The discovery of the golden plaque had transformed him from an anonymous diver into someone constantly under watch. Journalists calling, historians writing, strangers showing up at the docks with questions or wild theories. It all felt strange, unreal. He had wanted recognition once, but now he only longed for the quiet he'd lost. The lake had given him something priceless and taken something in return. He stood at the edge of the pier, hands deep in his jacket pockets, the mist swirling around his legs. The surface of the water was a perfect mirror, unbroken except for a faint ripple in the distance. Somewhere beneath that calm face lay the heart of El Dorado, the town that had slept for almost 2 centuries. The bank, the saloon, the silent streets, they had become a second home to him, a world where the noise of the modern world could not reach. And now another layer waited below that, a mystery of a different time. The sonar images from his last survey had been unmistakable. There was something metallic, something with symmetry too deliberate to be natural. The plane from 1986. For days he had postponed exploring it. Every time he thought of the wreck, something inside him hesitated, as though the lake itself were warning him not to go further. But curiosity had its own current, and once it caught you, there was no swimming against it. The archaeologists from the university were focused on the town, setting up their equipment on the northern shore, scanning old foundations and collecting sediment samples. Marcus had told no one about the aircraft, not even Evelyn Cho. He wasn't hiding it out of selfishness, but because he felt something deeply personal about it, an instinct that this last secret wasn't just history. It was unfinished business. He set out just after sunrise, the air biting at his cheeks. The boat's engine hummed quietly as he crossed the lake, the cold mist rising around him like breath from unseen lungs. The coordinates of the wreck lay near the southern edge, where the valley floor dipped sharply. He had marked it months earlier on his sonar grid, but now he would see it with his own eyes. When he reached the location, he cut the engine and let the boat drift. The silence that followed was absolute. He checked his oxygen tanks, tightened the straps on his wetsuit, and lowered the drone first. The small machine whirred softly as it sank into the green-black water, its light fading as it descended. The screen flickered with static before the image steadied. The murky darkness parted to reveal shapes emerging from the silt. A curved fuselage, a broken wing, the remains of propellers twisted like ribbons. Marcus leaned closer, his heart hammering. The wreck was remarkably intact, its outline unmistakable. He guided the drone around the perimeter, the light catching glints of metal where paint had long since peeled away. On the side of the fuselage, barely visible beneath layers of algae and rust, he made out the faint letters LA 4180. He didn't need to look it up. The number was etched into his memory from the accident report. The hydroplane that had gone down here nearly 40 years ago. He could almost picture it now. A sunny afternoon, the pilot banking low over the water, something going wrong, engine failure, a gust of wind, and then silence as the plane vanished into the lake. The official records had said the passengers escaped before it sank. But why had it never been recovered? The depth, perhaps, or the dangerous terrain of submerged debris that made salvage impossible. Still, the wreck had remained hidden all these years, just another secret added to the lake's growing collection. Marcus decided he needed to see it himself. He descended into the water, the cold biting into his skin even through the neoprene. The world around him dimmed until only the glow of his flashlight remained, a narrow cone of gold piercing the gloom. The drone hovered nearby like a silent companion. The descent was long, each meter feeling heavier than the last. When his fins brushed the soft silt at the bottom, the sound of his breathing seemed deafening in the stillness. He turned slowly, scanning the space around him, and then he saw it. The plane, resting on its belly, half buried in sediment, one wing twisted upward like a broken arm reaching for the surface. The sight was haunting. Tom had stripped the aircraft to color, but not its form. The propellers were bent inward, the cockpit glass shattered. A single seat remained upright inside, draped in a film of algae. Marcus floated closer, careful not to disturb the silt. He shone his light through the broken canopy. There were still instruments on the panel, dials and levers corroded but intact. The wheel hung loosely, tilted to one side. He reached in, brushing aside a thin layer of mud, and uncovered a faded object wedged between the seats, a metal flask engraved with initials. HD. He stared at it through his visor, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Whoever those initials belonged to had been a part of the last flight this machine ever made. He thought about the passengers, the panic they must have felt as the water rushed in, the desperate scramble to reach the surface. The reports had said all survived. Still, being down here among their final moments felt almost intrusive, like walking through someone else's memory. He moved along the fuselage, inspecting the torn metal, until something caught his light, a faint glimmer at the edge of his vision. He turned and saw a shape half buried in silt near the tail of the plane. It wasn't part of the wreck. It looked older, rougher, made of wood rather than metal. He brushed away the sediment with his gloved hand and felt the grain beneath his fingers. A plank, a beam, and below that, stone. His pulse quickened. The wreck hadn't just come to rest on the lake bed, it had crashed directly into the ruins of the old town. He followed the outline, tracing it along the ground until his light revealed a doorway, its wooden frame still standing, reinforced by stone blocks. Letters were faintly carved above the entrance, eroded by time, but still visible. He leaned closer, squinting through the murk. Post office. The plane had landed squarely on top of El Dorado's post office. The collision of centuries was staggering. 19th century craftsmanship crushed beneath 20th century machinery, both now entombed together in silence. Marcus spent the next hour documenting everything. He filmed the wreck from every angle, capturing the eerie juxtaposition of metal and stone, of past and present fused together by the weight of water. When he finally began his ascent, his arms ached and his air was running low. As he rose, he turned off his light for a moment and looked up. The surface was a faint shimmer far above, a thin, unreachable line of silver. For a fleeting second, he understood the lake in a way he never had before. It wasn't just water. It was memory made liquid, preserving everything that had ever touched it. He broke the surface, gasping, the cold air burning his lungs. The sky had turned overcast, the light dim and heavy. He pulled himself onto the boat, dripping and shivering, and sat for a long time staring at the ripples spreading outward. The plane's image burned in his mind. The broken wings, the initials on the flask, the buried doorway beneath. There was a pattern forming, though he couldn't quite define it. The town, the bank, the plane, all pieces of a story stretching across generations. He felt as though he had been chosen to witness it, to connect the fragments before they disappeared for good. That evening, he watched the footage on his computer. The drone's camera had captured every detail in startling clarity. The wreck shimmered like a ghost in the green water, its outlines slowly dissolving into the darkness. When the camera passed over the buried post office, he froze the frame. There, on the stone threshold, a small plaque was barely visible. He zoomed in, adjusting the contrast until the engraving came into focus. United States Postal Service, established 1850. His breath caught. The same year the town was incorporated. Somehow, even this small discovery felt profound, a symbol of connection between the living and the forgotten. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window, listening to the wind move through the trees. The reflection of the moon shimmered faintly on the lake, pale and trembling. He thought about how much of life rested on things unseen, the layers of history beneath our feet, the echoes of choices made long before we were born. The next morning, he would meet with Dr. Cho and show her the footage. Maybe she would see what he saw, that the past wasn't buried but suspended, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. When dawn came, he packed the hard drives, the recovered flask, and his notes. Evelyn arrived at the dock, bundled in a heavy coat, her breath forming small clouds in the air. She watched the footage silently, her eyes reflecting the blue glow of the screen. When it ended, she sat back, speechless for a moment. "You realize what this means?" she said finally. "We're not just dealing with a 19th century site anymore. This place is a palimpsest, a record of everything that's happened here, layer upon layer." Marcus nodded slowly. It's like time never stopped moving. It just changed direction. Over the following weeks, they began preparing for a joint expedition to map the entire southern section of the lake. The university provided funding for deeper equipment, including a submersible drone capable of descending below 100 meters. Marcus found himself both exhilarated and uneasy. Each new discovery seemed to draw them closer to something larger than archaeology, a truth about the way history repeats itself, leaving traces in unexpected places. One late afternoon, as he walked along the shoreline, he found an old woman sitting on a bench overlooking the water. She was wrapped in a shawl, her hair white as frost. When he greeted her, she smiled faintly. "My brother used to talk about this place," she said. "He worked construction on the dam back in the 40s. Said they never told the newspapers what really happened when the valley flooded. Whole families had to leave in a single night. Some never even packed. The water came faster than they expected." Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine. Did he ever mention the name of the town? El Dorado, she said, her eyes distant. They thought the name was cursed. Gold brought them there, and water buried them. He thanked her quietly and walked back to his truck, the sound of her words following him like an echo. That night, he wrote them down in his notebook, underlined twice. Gold and water. Greed and consequence. It struck him that the lake had always been a mirror for human ambition. What people sought most was what ultimately consumed them. As winter deepened, Marcus spent less time underwater and more time cataloging his findings. The safe, the plaque, the sign from the bank, the footage of the post office. All were carefully preserved and labeled. Yet, no matter how much evidence he gathered, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished. There was something he hadn't yet seen, something waiting in the dark water. Every night, he dreamed of the lake, its depths alive with faint light, as if the town itself were calling him back. On the last day of the year, he returned once more to the dock. The lake was frozen at the edges, thin sheets of ice cracking softly against the pier. The sun hung low, pale and distant. Marcus stood there for a long time, watching the water breathe beneath the ice, and whispered into the wind, "I'll come back." Because he knew that even after all the discoveries, all the proof, the lake still held its final secret, and he wasn't done listening. The winter deepened around the lake, transforming the valley into a muted landscape of white and silver. Frost gathered on the pine branches, and the surface of the water glistened under a thin crust of ice that crept outward from the banks. Marcus stood by the dock in the dim morning light, his breath hanging like smoke in the air. The world seemed to hold its breath with him, as if waiting for whatever came next. It had been weeks since his last dive, weeks since he had uncovered the plane and the buried post office beneath it. And though the discoveries had brought him attention and admiration, they had also brought an uneasy quiet into his soul. He had begun to dream of the lake almost every night. Dark corridors stretching endlessly beneath the surface, walls whispering in voices that weren't quite real. He always awoke with his heart pounding, drenched in sweat, staring into the shadows as if they might still be moving. The university's research project had grown. Dr. Cho's team had set up temporary trailers on the North Shore, filled with equipment and monitors that hummed softly through the cold nights. They were studying the rate of decay in the submerged town, measuring the oxygen levels in the deepest water, and running simulations on how the structures had survived for so long. Marcus often visited, helping where he could, but he spent most of his time alone. He had never been comfortable in crowds, and now the academic bustle only made him feel more distant from the thing he loved. The lake didn't belong to data or reports. It was something alive, something that demanded respect rather than analysis. One morning, as he reviewed the sonar logs from the last month, he noticed something that made him pause. There was a new disturbance in one of the southern readings, a faint echo pattern that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a natural shape. It had symmetry, depth, and the density of metal. But the location was odd, far from the known wreckage or structures, almost beyond the edge of the valley basin. He marked the coordinates, frowning. Maybe it was a glitch, but something about it didn't sit right. He decided he would check it himself the next day before telling anyone else. The sky was gray the following morning, a flat sheet of cloud that promised snow. They launched before dawn, the hum of the motor muffled by fog. The water was colder than he remembered, the kind of cold that sank into bone and stayed there. When he reached the coordinates, the sonar pulsed again, and the same shape appeared, a narrow, elongated form lying just above the slope where the lake bed dropped into darkness. Marcus lowered the drone, watching the screen as the camera descended through the murk. The light caught the edge of something smooth, metallic, and cylindrical. It wasn't a plane or a boat. It was too regular, too intact. As he adjusted the angle, the image sharpened. It looked like a piece of machinery, some kind of large pipe or chamber, half buried in silt. He blinked at the screen. It made no sense. The dam had been built upstream. There shouldn't be industrial debris here. The construction logs he'd read didn't mention anything like it. He steered the drone closer, his heartbeat quickening. The camera's light swept across the surface, revealing faded paint beneath layers of algae. There were markings, letters barely visible but still legible. P-Valve Unit 1940. His mind raced. It was part of the original dam infrastructure, perhaps a pressure valve system abandoned during the flooding. But why was it here, far from the dam itself? And more importantly, why was it intact? Marcus decided to go down himself. He couldn't resist the pull of the unknown any longer. He geared up carefully, checking his tank pressure twice, and descended along the drone's tether line. The first 30 feet were easy, cold but clear. Then, as he reached deeper water, visibility dropped sharply. The beam of his light illuminated only a few feet ahead, a swirling fog of sediment drifting like smoke. When he finally saw the metallic structure, it loomed out of the gloom like a sleeping giant. He reached out and touched it. The surface was slick and cold, unbroken except for a seam running along one side. He followed it downward and found what looked like a hatch, sealed tight with rusted bolts. He brushed at the silt covering the hatch and froze. Beneath his glove, faint blue light flickered. For a moment, he thought it was a reflection from his own gear, but then it pulsed again, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat. It wasn't bright, just a soft glow leaking through the seam. He leaned closer, his breath loud in his helmet. Could it be a chemical reaction? Some kind of trapped gas igniting under pressure? He couldn't tell. The glow faded, then returned, rhythmic and deliberate. He shivered, not from the cold this time, but from something deeper, a sense that the lake was not as lifeless as he had believed. He rose slowly, marking the coordinates in his wrist computer. The ascent felt longer than usual, the water pressing against him with invisible hands. When he broke the surface, the fog had thickened, swallowing the shoreline. For a moment, he couldn't tell which direction was which. The silence was total, oppressive. He pulled himself into the boat and sat trembling, staring at the ripples spreading outward from where he'd surfaced. The glow, the hidden machinery, it all felt too deliberate, too purposeful. And yet, when he later showed the footage to Dr. Cho, she frowned and shook her head. "There's nothing here," she said. "The feed cuts out halfway through the descent. Maybe a magnetic interference from the valve casing. The depth's high enough for anomalies." Marcus stared at the screen. The footage was dark, the light cutting off just before the moment he remembered touching the hatch. The glow wasn't there. The recording ended in static. "It was glowing," he said quietly, almost to himself. There was light inside. She gave him a patient smile. "Marcus, fatigue and cold can play tricks underwater. You've been diving too often. Take a few days off, let the lake rest." Her tone was kind but dismissive. He didn't argue. There was no point. But as he walked away, the image of that slow, pulsing blue light burned in his mind, as vivid as the day he had first seen the saloon sign. The next week brought heavy snow. The university packed up their equipment and left, promising to return in spring. Marcus stayed. He couldn't leave, not when the lake was whispering unfinished stories beneath its frozen skin. He spent his days studying maps, cross-referencing construction blueprints of the dam with the sonar scans he'd collected. The more he looked, the stranger it seemed. There were discrepancies, sections of pipework that didn't match the official records, entire corridors unaccounted for. It was as if someone had built more beneath the water than anyone was ever meant to know. One night, unable to sleep, he drove back to the dock. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear, the stars mirrored perfectly in the lake below. He sat on the pier with a thermos of coffee, listening to the ice shift and groan. Then, faintly, he heard something else. A low hum, so deep it felt rather than sounded. It came from below, steady and rhythmic, almost mechanical. The hairs on his arms rose. He turned off his flashlight and leaned over the edge, staring into the black water. The hum grew louder, resonating through the wood beneath him. He whispered aloud without realizing, "You're still alive down there, aren't you?" The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence returned, but Marcus no longer felt alone. He sat for a long time, the cold biting into his fingers before finally heading home. In the following days, he tried to rationalize what he'd experienced. Machinery could sometimes vibrate under changes in temperature, he told himself. The dam wasn't far. Perhaps he had heard pressure adjustments from the main valves, yet, deep down, he knew that wasn't it. The sound had come from the southern basin, from the same coordinates where the glowing hatch waited. Something was active there, after all these decades. He felt torn between fear and fascination. Finally, he made his decision. On the first clear morning, he would dive again. He would go deeper, stay longer, bring stronger lights and an auxiliary camera. He needed to see what the lake was hiding, not for fame or proof this time, but for himself. Because somewhere beneath all the mud and memory, beneath the wrecked planes and forgotten streets, lay a truth the water had been guarding for generations. As he prepared his gear that night, he caught sight of the golden plaque on his desk, the one from the bank safe. Its engraved names shimmered faintly in the lamplight. He traced them with his fingers, feeling the grooves like a pulse under his skin. Those people had built their world believing it would last forever. Maybe, in some strange way, it had. Perhaps the lake had simply found a different way to remember them. When he turned off the light and looked out the window, the moon was high and silver, casting a path across the frozen water. Somewhere down there, beneath the calm and the cold, something waited for him. He didn't yet know whether it would bring understanding or destruction, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would go back. Because the lake still had one more secret, and he was the only one willing to listen long enough to hear it. The last snow of the season melted quietly in the valley, leaving behind the scent of wet pine and thawing soil. Spring sunlight returned with cautious warmth, glinting on the edges of the lake like shards of broken glass. The ice had receded in slow, uneven sheets, and the water beneath was darker now, deeper somehow, as though the long winter had changed its mood. Marcus Hill stood at the dock again, his reflection distorted in the ripples. The fatigue in his eyes was more than physical. He had not truly slept since that night he heard the hum rising through the frozen wood. Something in it had felt alive, too deliberate to dismiss. He'd told no one. The research teams had long since packed up, leaving only quiet and wind behind, and he had spent the long, lonely months of winter replaying that sound in his mind until it became inseparable from his heartbeat. Now, the thaw had brought both opportunity and unease. He was ready to dive again, but this time not for artifacts or validation. What pulled him back was a feeling he couldn't explain, an unspoken debt to the depths that had kept him company when the rest of the world had gone silent. He packed his gear slowly, each motion deliberate, his gloves brushing the metal tanks as though memorizing them. The air smelled faintly of diesel and rust. He checked the oxygen levels twice, then once more, almost ritualistically. He'd rebuilt his lighting rig during the winter, fitted it with a brighter beam and reinforced its casing. If he found the valve again, the one with the glowing seam, he'd see it clearly this time. There would be no tricks of the eye, no technical excuses. The morning was cloudless, the lake flat and still. He launched the small motorboat and guided it across the water. The hum of the engine seemed intrusive in the hush of early spring, breaking the fragile silence. As he passed the spot where he'd first found the saloon 2 seasons ago, he slowed the motor. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the faint shape of the old roof below, a ghostly outline beneath the shifting light. He smiled despite himself. The town was still there, untouched, patient as ever. It had endured for generations, and it would outlast them all. The coordinates for the valve lay near the deepest point of the lake. The sonar flickered as he approached, its rhythmic pulses painting the unseen world below in bright lines. There it was again, the long, cylindrical shadow resting along the slope. He anchored carefully, lowered the drone, and watched the feed on the monitor. The camera descended through water so clear it felt unnatural, the sunlight fading slowly until everything turned the color of old glass. Then, as before, the smooth metallic shape emerged from the gloom. It was exactly as he remembered, unyielding and silent. But the hatch, the one that had glowed, looked different now. The edges were cleaner, less buried. The sediment had shifted, exposing more of the structure. He could see the bolts, the faint lines of paint still clinging to the surface. He hovered the drone closer. The camera light caught a faint sheen, a glimmer deep in the seam, just as it had months ago. He leaned toward the monitor, breath shallow. The glow returned, steady this time, pulsing with quiet rhythm, like the steady beat of a human heart. It wasn't illusion. It wasn't imagination. Marcus sat frozen, the world shrinking to that single impossible point of light. He didn't think, he simply acted. He switched off the drone's lights, put on his gear, and prepared for descent. The air hissed in his tank, a comforting sound. He checked his gauges, tightened the straps, and slipped into the water. The cold was sharper than he'd expected, cutting through the thin layer of neoprene like shards of glass, but the shock cleared his mind. The surface dimmed above him, and within moments there was only the deep hush of the lake. The silence was complete, broken only by the slow, rhythmic hiss of his own breath. He followed the tether line down, each kick of his fins drawing him closer to the dark shape below. The light from his helmet lamp carved a narrow path through the murk, shimmering against the suspended particles that drifted like dust motes in an endless hallway. The structure loomed ahead, larger than memory, its surface slick and alien in the faint glow. The blue light within the hatch was visible now, stronger, spilling through the narrow seam in soft, deliberate pulses. Marcus approached cautiously, one hand outstretched. The metal vibrated faintly beneath his fingertips, alive with something that felt almost like breath. He traced the seam of the hatch, feeling the texture beneath his gloves. It was warmer than the surrounding water, impossibly so. He positioned the camera to capture everything, but a flicker of static passed across his feed. The recording stuttered once, twice, then froze. He didn't care. He couldn't look away. He saw that the bolts securing the hatch were loose. Perhaps the pressure of time had corroded them. Perhaps they had been tampered with long ago. He hesitated only a moment before taking out the wrench clipped to his belt. The first bolt turned easily, flaking rust drifting away in the slow motion. The second was harder, and the effort sent a sharp jolt up his arm. He paused, steadying his breath. The light beneath the hatch pulsed faster, as if responding to him. It was almost hypnotic, the rhythm syncing with his own heartbeat. He reached for the final bolt. When it gave, the sound was not a creak but a sigh, deep and soft, as if the lake itself were exhaling. A thin cloud of air escaped from the seam, shimmering with tiny bubbles that caught the light like silver dust. Then the hatch cracked open. The glow spilled out in a bright, liquid pulse, illuminating everything around him in hues of blue and gold. It wasn't mechanical light, not the harsh fluorescence of machinery, but something softer, organic, almost serene. Marcus shielded his eyes, though the brightness didn't burn. Instead, it surrounded him with warmth, chasing away the cold of the water. He tried to peer inside, but the light was too dense, too fluid, as though it were alive, swirling gently behind the open hatch. He could see faint shapes within it, metal girders, pipes, perhaps remnants of machinery long dormant. Yet, the deeper he looked, the less he understood what he was seeing. The blue light pulsed again, slower now, and for a fleeting second he thought he saw movement, a shadow passing behind the glow. Something, or someone, had been sealed within. His breath caught, and the regulator hissed loudly in his ears. He stepped back instinctively, his fin brushing the lake bed, sending a cloud of silt rising around him. The light dimmed slightly, as though reacting to the disturbance. Then, from somewhere within the structure, a low vibration echoed through the water. It was the same hum he had heard that night months ago, only stronger now, fuller. It wasn't frightening. It was aware. The sound resonated through his chest, through the metal of his tank, through the bones of his hands. He wanted to speak, to say something, though to what, he didn't know. A sudden pressure shift pushed him backward. The hatch sealed itself again with a dull, heavy thud, the light vanishing instantly. The hum faded, replaced once more by silence. Marcus hovered there in the dark, his heart hammering. The hatch was closed, the seam smooth again, as if it had never been opened. He checked his gauges. The oxygen was lower than he'd thought. His hands shook as he grabbed the tether line and began his ascent. The upward journey felt endless, his body heavy, the cold seeping into his veins. When he finally broke the surface, he gasped, dragging in lungfuls of crisp air. The sunlight seemed impossibly bright. He climbed into the boat, collapsing onto the wet floorboards. His mind was racing, but no words would come. The hum still echoed faintly in his bones, like a memory too strong to fade. The hatch, the light, the warmth, it had all been real. He knew it. He stared out at the water, its calm surface betraying nothing of what lay beneath. Whatever he had awakened, or glimpsed, had returned to its sleep, but not before acknowledging him. In the days that followed, Marcus said nothing. He avoided the university team when they returned, speaking only when necessary. They noticed his change, but didn't press. He spent hours on the shore instead, sketching diagrams from memory, trying to make sense of the structure he had seen. It wasn't part of the original dam. The materials were too advanced, the design unlike anything from the 1940s. He sent fragments of his sonar data to a friend in Sacramento who worked in civil engineering, and the reply came back puzzled. "Whatever you found," the message said, "it's not on any record, and if it's really there, it wasn't built by the dam contractors. Be careful, Marcus." He read the message once, then closed his laptop. there was nothing more to say. The lake had kept its secrets for nearly 2 centuries, and now, after all his searching, it had finally shown him one, but not in a way the world could ever understand. Maybe some truths weren't meant to be documented, only witnessed. That evening, he sat on the dock as the sun set behind the hills. The water glowed gold, calm and unbroken. He dropped a small stone into it and watched the ripples expand outward, each one fading softly into the next. He thought of the miners and their dream of gold, of the families who had built the town and lost it to rising water, of the pilot whose plane had fallen onto a post office built a century before his birth. Every life, every dream, layered here beneath his feet, preserved in stillness. He smiled faintly, realizing that in all his searching for buried treasure, what he had truly uncovered was the endurance of memory itself. The lake wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was held together by them. It was the sum of every heartbeat that had ever echoed through the valley, of every voice swallowed by time, but never lost. And now, somewhere deep below, one of those voices had answered him. When darkness finally settled, Marcus turned off his flashlight and sat listening. The lake was quiet again, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the wooden pier. Yet, in the silence he could still sense it, the faint, steady rhythm pulsing deep below, not threatening, not mournful, just alive. The heartbeat of El Dorado, still echoing through the centuries. He whispered into the night, barely audible over the breeze, "I hear you," and for the first time in months, he felt peace. Subscribe now. You won't believe what we uncover next. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive into the secrets buried beneath America's forgotten places. Watch our other videos for more unbelievable true stories, and share this video with your friends. Someone you know will be shocked by what lies under the surface.